Hi, good morning, everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces and some new ones as well. I want to welcome you to the Silver City Museum and thank you for showing up on this beautiful Saturday morning for the fifth in our series of community conversations called Unpacking Silver City. And we have had a great run so far, and I'm sure we will continue to do so today. I want to thank our friends at WIL, the Western Institute for Lifelong Learning. You see the representative from WIL, Mary, up there on your screen, and she'll be here with us throughout the lecture. If you have any questions later on, you can ask her about any technical difficulties, and I'll be here as well. She'll be coming on to tell us a little bit about WIL in just a minute. And I want to thank the New Mexico Humanities Council, who has funded this in part. So let me give a little bit of a rundown of how this goes. And if you have not been with us before for one of our programs or one of our Unpacking Silver talks, what we are trying to do with this series is to really focus on individual themes that are intrinsic to our community and our way of life here in Silver City and Grant County. So we've gone through themes of the economy with Dr. Scott Fritz. We've talked about the role of government in Grant County with Dr. Doug Dinwiddie. We've talked about community building with Susan Berry. And today, we've talked about the Old West mythos with Jim Smith. And today we're going to continue on our conversation talking about healthcare. And throughout all of these, we have a primary speaker that I mentioned before. Today's featured presenter is Heather Moreland. She has studied at the History of Medicine at Western New Mexico University and University of New Mexico. She's been interested in history for a long time and has taught history at WNMU, UNM, as well as at WIL, the Western Institute for Lifelong Learning. So we are very happy to have her on board and be talking to us today. And along with our featured presenters, we have a small break after the main presentation, and then we'll have a community conversation with two wonderful guest commentators. In the past, we've had Harry Brown, we've had some representatives, we've had all sorts of members of the community that are stakeholders and have some interesting things to say in their field. And today is no exception. We have Dr. Montoya, who is a retired physician and a big fan of history. He's done some presentations with the Silver City Museum before that have been amazing and informative, and I encourage you to check them out on our YouTube channel. And we have Charlie Alfaro, founder of HMS, and many, many more things that we'll tell you about in a little bit. We'll be interested to get into that conversation. So let me bring on Mary Stecker, our representative from WIL, who is working in the back end in the scenes to make sure everything goes smooth here. Mary?
I appreciate having the opportunity to not only thank you, Erin, for working with WIL over this summer, but all of you who are attending the Unpacking Silver City series over this past couple of months. And I think we have one more to go here in August. But WIL, or the Western Institute for Lifelong Learning, began as an idea of three visionaries here in the early 2000s in Silver City, Grant County. And they had a dream of building an Institute for Lifelong Learning that was located in Grant County. And by 2005, they'd enacted that dream. And so for the past 16 years now, WIL has been engaging with folks like all of you here in Silver City, New Mexico and Grant County. So welcome, appreciate your coming for this session. We're very proud to be working with the museum this summer, helping them to present the Unpacking Silver City series, and appreciate your being here. Erin, go for it.
All right, I will. Thank you very much, Mary. And so we're going to go ahead and get started here. If you have any questions for our presenter, please hold off until after she is finished talking. In the meantime, you can put those in the QA box or in the chat box. And then when the QA portion comes around, then we'll make sure that they get to her. And okay, so hold on one moment. And here is Miss Heather Moreland.
What I'm talking about today is some of the history of the area as far as healthcare goes. And let's see if we can get. So we're talking about the evolution of hospital care in this particular time period. I want to thank a number of people here who have helped put this together. On the agenda today, we'll talk a little bit about the healthcare in this area before the first hospital was developed. We'll talk about what kinds of illnesses people might expect, and then the start of the hospital and the TB movement. So the operative word here is brief. The native peoples had their own way of treating injuries and diseases. When the Spaniards came, they brought, especially the Jesuits, brought their own ways of healing from the old world. The Mexicans also had their ways, and things eventually came to a combination. In essence, most of the overview from times before pathophysiology was made known. Ceremonies to restore balance seem to be the way to go. They had little knowledge of anatomy and physiology, and so science as we know it now can give us insights into what to heal and how to heal. But in earlier days, people tended to do what seemed to make sense. This concept of being out of balance seemed to create different methods of dealing with what they thought was in or out of balance, such as if people were having seizures. Some cultures might do trepanation, boring a hole into the skull to let out the evil spirit. And we still do that. And we have someone with a blood clot on the brain to evacuate the clot. Knowledge of local plants and herbs is developed by observation and trial and error. Pinon bark resin for intestinal troubles, or to draw out pus, or mesquite gum for sores, sunburn, gargles. Powdered sumac bark was also used to put on the sores from smallpox. So here we have just a quick view of early Silver City. So I need to remind everyone to think again about how things are for us today in the aspect of healthcare, and realize that in the 19th century, things were very different for the folks who lived here, even into the 20th century. There are a lot of the younger generation who have never even heard of some of these infections that were killing people, and that's because immunizations were developed, and most folks don't even have to think twice about it unless there's a strange outbreak. There was no indoor plumbing. Water around the country in the 19th century may or may not have been drinkable. Indoor plumbing, sewage. There was a story about a physician who came to Silver City in the early part of the 20th century and to work at one of the sanatoriums, and was shocked to find out that there were so many houses around the town that still had outhouses. There was a lot of pollution, as you can imagine, from the mines or from people using horses and oxen. Germ theory was not quite de rigueur at the middle or early part of the latter century. The humors, yellow bile, black bile, etc., were more the norm of what people were accepting. In the 19th century, there were a lot of childhood diseases, and we'll mention a few things, but the expectation for life expectancy under 5 was 40 to 50% of death. So if you had a child, you knew there was a fair chance that something would happen to that child. In the early part of the 19th century, maybe you'd be around 40 years of age when you died, 63 at the latter part of the century. Germ theory was becoming accepted, and vaccinations were just starting to happen. There was a large sanitary movement at the point of the turn into the 20th century. Antibiotics were being experimented with, and a wealth of technology in the healthcare fields because of new understanding and development in the sciences. Plus, when you throw in a war here and there, there's always advances in surgery. To give you a look at places like New York with overcrowding, there'd be plenty of families crowded into one room. Children had to work because the family needed the income. Some kids were able to get to school, but it was pretty touch and go. Strong push for the public health reforms helped move things along. There were so many people coming into the United States from other places on the planet. But I, for one, am glad that the government intervened and started passing laws that dairies could not add chalk, or TB germs needed to be pasteurized. I'm very glad that there are fire escapes and fire extinguishers and fire exits after, usually laws passed after many disasters. Some of the scientific developments early in the 19th century, René Laennec was too embarrassed to put his ear against a woman's breast to listen to the heart. And so he developed a tube to use in order to listen, and that evolved into the monaural stethoscope and then into the binaural stethoscopes. Antony van Leeuwenhoek developed an early form of microscope to magnify, just for fun, in essence, what he found under pond water. Over time, people developed more and more aspects to be able to use magnification to see more clearly, which of course then later in the century came up with the idea of germ theory. This big boxy thing in the right-hand side of the slide is an electron microscope. And so in the early 1930s, people were actually able to see viruses. Prior to that, they were only guesstimated that there were other things causing infection that people could not see. Pharmaceuticals, you may wind up using patent medicines. You may, if you had some training and the money, have a kit in order to bring it along with you as you make house calls. There were lots of things, but not particularly regulated the way they are now. I threw in this picture here on the left called a chill pill. Very different from what we think of chill pills nowadays. This, in essence, was if you took a chill, in other words, catching a cold, you were offered one of these. And if you look closely, it's quinine and cinchona, which were, in essence, used successfully for malaria. So we'll talk a little bit about the common infectious diseases in historic Grand County. First, though, a word about words. Bacteria and viruses, not the same thing, sort of the old apples and oranges perspective. They are germs, but different. And just to be clear, just as with other roots, words that were rooted in Latin, bacterium is the singular, bacteria is the plural, phenomena, datum, data. And there are plenty other words that we won't need to go into now. So polio is one of the infections that has been around for many, many years. At that time, they didn't have a clue what was causing the destruction of the nervous system. In the United States in 1884 in New York, a physician started keeping track of cases. The outbreaks tended to be in the summer months, and just prior to the US going into the First World War, there was a massive outbreak and it led to a lot of awareness. The other name that people used was infantile paralysis, because mostly children were getting this, and public health measures for prevention came along, and then in the 50s, the vaccines. But it wasn't only children who developed this. You'll recognize FDR, the president for 4 terms. You can, if you look carefully, you'll see how scrawny his legs are. He had a lot of upper body strength because he had contracted polio when he was 39. It was a severe case and he was expected to die. And then because they called in some specialists, he did survive. These are iron lungs. People who had the infection spread up to their rib cages, they could not breathe on their own. And so these patients were put into the iron lungs, which had a pressure gradient on and off to help expand and contract the lungs. And then, as I said, there was a further development push in the 50s to get people the polio vaccine. Diphtheria has been around also for a while. In the 1700s. It was very likely that if your child contracted this, he or she would die. The germ was isolated in the latter part of the century, and because it would come in waves, people would forget about the danger and then become worried again. By the end of the century, toxin was developed in order to combat antitoxin was developed in order to combat the toxin. And you can see in this photo, they would inject horses with a small amount of the diphtheria toxin, and then the horse's body would react to it and try to fight it off. And then that serum was developed into something that they could use to immunize patients. Antibiotics now, of course, are used. Now, I don't know if you all remember the story of Balto, but being an incurable romantic, I threw this in. The antitoxin had developed in the 1920s. It was around the country, but in Alaska, only Anchorage had a supply. And up in Nome, there was a severe outbreak of diphtheria. And they, because it was wintertime, could not transport easily. There was one plane, but the wings were frozen. They couldn't get off the ground. So they began a series of dog sledding up to Nome, and nowadays it is known as the Iditarod. This is a statue of Balto in the park, in Central Park in New York. There's some question if Balto was actually the lead dog in the last segment of the Iditarod, but according to the newspapers, Fox was the name of the dog, but the name Balto was much more newsworthy. You can see also in this slide, there is a severe white plaque here. One of the problems with the toxin, it could form a membrane crossing the throat, and that would suffocate the person. So it was not a pleasant disease to have to suffer through. Cholera was called the Blue Death as opposed to the Black Death of the bubonic plague because of the dusky hue of the skin. It was first observed in the early part of the century in the United States and was brought over and started showing up in ports because, of course, there were no airplanes then. People were using shipping to travel and to bring supplies around. So along the trade routes, things started showing up. Severe mortality rate and various outbreaks nowadays, antibiotics and rehydration may be able to save you. Whooping cough. This picture of the infant, I think, is particularly telling. You can really see this child struggling to breathe, even though it's a still photo. It's highly contagious. We do have the pertussis, the DPT, immunization for children, but the coughing spells that people would get would cause such a horrendous sound. That's why the name whooping cough was developed. And some people could not catch their breaths because the spasm caused by the infection. Scarlet fever, strep was the cause that they found out later, and with other infections, this toxin from the strep can cause permanent damage to the heart and lungs, heart and kidneys. And so even though you think, oh, it's just a simple red rash, it could be a severe case. Measles, again, we do have measles, mumps, rubella vaccination now, but back in the day, this was so contagious. Most people who were locals, Native Americans, for example, had developed no immunity to this infection, and it wiped out large portions of the population. Influenza, most everyone's heard of the Spanish flu pandemic, and because this was caused by a virus, there was very little that people could do about it except symptomatic treatment. You may not know the reason that it is called the Spanish flu. This happened at the close of the First World War. Most countries involved in the warfare had passed laws limiting the amount of news that could be talked about and printed. And Spain was not involved in the war. And because there were outbreaks in various countries around the world, and Spain didn't have the restriction on news, people started calling it the Spanish flu because the Spanish were printing news stories about this horrendous epidemic. And so the name stuck. Silver City had some cases. We did have lots of the quarantine measures with the masks and no mass gatherings such as in church or movie theaters. But Mogollon was actually hit much worse, to the point that many of the residents were convinced that the Germans, the enemy, had from the war, had flown secretly planes across the ocean, coming to Mogollon and dropping the influenza germ specifically on Mogollon because they had so many cases. Smallpox has been around for quite a long time, and you can see from these Egyptian mummies, this one doesn't show up very well, but you can see some, and also here, some of the bony problems from the pox itself as it ate away. It has caused many, many deaths throughout the centuries in China and probably in India, and then in the Middle East. They had developed various ways of dealing with it. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in the early 1700s had married a man who was an ambassador from Britain to Turkey. And she found out that they treated smallpox, or they prepared preventative for smallpox by taking some of the pustular matter and scratching it into the skins of people. And those people most likely did not get the infection, or if they did, it was a mild case. And Lady Mary was particularly interested in this because in her younger years, she had a severe case of the infection when she was still in England. And because of that, she had severe scars. And most people who had this and survived did have severe scars. And it's not like you may see people, particularly if they've never had the vaccination against chickenpox, you might see a little pit here and there. Well, this was not that simple if you had smallpox. The Montagues returned to England, and she got her friends and the monarchy to start using this type of inoculation. But Edward Jenner, at the end of the century, because he was a physician and a male and had better press, is the one who's noted for using cowpox to vaccinate people. There's Lady Mary, and there's Edward Jenner. This is smallpox. This is an unfortunate case. This fellow, you can hopefully see some of his pox. And now for a scarier picture. This little child, this is not an active case. These are the scars that were left over from having smallpox. Very severe infection and many complications. And then tuberculosis. This is the infection that saved Silver City in many ways, even though many died from the disease. It's been around for quite a long time. It's believed thousands of years. TB can be in the lungs or in other parts of the body. In 1882, Robert Koch from Germany, a physician and a microbiologist, was doing studies and was able to isolate anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. If you studied micro, you know that Koch's postulates helped people identify scientifically the causes of infection. Tuberculosis, it's said to have killed 1 in 7 of all the people who ever lived. Easily transmissible, especially in overcrowded locations. And because there was no scientific treatment such as antibiotics for it, many people suffered from it and passed it on. There was a bit of a cult of tuberculosis in the latter part of the 19th century. The wealthier people thought it was chic to be long and lean and pale. They had face powders made of ground rice so that they could make themselves look paler. But I imagine the folks who actually had the disease and suffered from it were not particularly enamored of the concept. There, over the years before antibiotics, various ideas about treating tuberculosis, from onions to coconuts to aloe. They also had coal tar, which had been around for a few hundred years, but they decided if they could burn some coal tar under a heat lamp. This is a cresoline lamp. And the fumes would help your lungs, which of course was not helpful in the least because it's a poison. Then towards the middle of the century, it was realized that people who had gone to a high altitude with dry air tended to recuperate. So here's a picture of Switzerland, which always makes me think of a different movie. And places that had high altitude and dry air were sought out as the idea spread as a way to help cure this infection, or at least keep people from an early death. This map you can't see very well as far as the details of it, but you can see large clusters around Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and around Silver City, where people were coming to the TB sanatoria as they developed. Now, one of the things that helped bring people to the sanatoria were the railroads. And you can see how this has many of the stops that long gone that we no longer have. And from the East Coast and then from the West Coast, people could come to a certain point and then get up to Silver City. In Colorado Springs, because this was at a stop near the railroad, the Antler Hotel was a popular place for tuberculosis patients to recuperate. And Montezuma's Castle in Las Vegas, New Mexico also. There is, for these folks, you'd have to have some money, and there was the benefit of being considered a resort as opposed to a patient who was dying from tuberculosis. To add to the mix, there was a nationwide panic of 1893, and it's one of those butterfly effects kind of things that something happened here and there around the world and caused the Sherman Silver Purchase Act to be repealed. And so what does this have to do with Silver City? Well, the economy in silver, because so much of it was based on silver, the economy locally crashed, and the economic problem was severe enough that people were concerned what to do. But because we had the altitude and the right climate, tuberculosis saved the day, even if it was only for a period of time. Here is the Silver City Reduction Works on the south end of Bullard. And even though it was noisy and polluted the air, it certainly had an effect on keeping silver going. But as silver was needed less and less for the economy, for the government, things became quiet. So here we have, just as when the mines closed here in the 1980s, the area started advertising as a place to retire in hopes of bringing people here to improve the economy. The panic of '93 led to Silver City advertising it as a place for tuberculosis. As early as 1880, the Herald newspaper declared Grant County as a health resort favorable to southern Italy, which I find amusing. The Enterprise on its masthead would add that this quote here, the best climate in the world, a paradise for consumptives, and that was from 1892 to 1899. It did some clever footwork and thinking to get the word out. A lot of people, a lot of the doctors knew specialists back east and got them to send patients. Lots of advertising, etc. So here is our main local pharmacy at the time. Many of the physicians were scattered around or not well trained, and the druggist was the person who you may rely on. This is Doc Bailey's store on Main and Broadway. We did have a number of local doctors, and this is just a few. Some of them came and went quickly, and some of them stayed for some years. This last fellow, I'm going to talk a little bit more about soon. Because people came and went, we don't know for sure if it was their skills or lack of work, or they found a job elsewhere. But doctors may or may not have been well trained. There was no regulation in New Mexico until 1923 about passing examinations to get your license. But Dr. Slow, William McLean Slow, was in charge of a hospital in Cincinnati and helped out in the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis. He was a skilled surgeon. He did have tuberculosis and died in 1892 in El Paso, but I want to also mention his father, who had a connection to New Mexico, even though they were a family from Ohio. John Slow was supposedly rather sharp-tongued and had a fiery temper. He was in the Civil War and in Colorado when the war started, and so he formed a battalion and went down to Fort Union in northern New Mexico and fought in the Battle of Glorieta, which routed the Confederates from the territory. He was appointed Chief Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court, but he got on the wrong side of William Reinerson, who was part of the Santa Fe Ring, and they insulted each other in essence. And just before Christmas in 1867, Reinerson confronted him in Santa Fe and pulled a gun on him, and Slow, being with his fiery temper, decided that he would just say, "Oh yeah, go ahead and shoot." And then when he realized that Reinerson actually was cocking his pistol, he tried to pull out his pistol, but was too late. Received a deadly shot, took him 2 days to die. And Reinerson, because of his pals in the Santa Fe ring, was found not guilty of murder. Reinerson was the district attorney in Doña Ana and Lincoln counties. And you'll recall at this time, there was a fellow named Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County Wars. And when Billy was captured, Reinerson, because he was on the Murphy Dolan side, had Billy's trial moved from Lincoln County down to Doña Ana, where Billy didn't have friends and was convicted. I do want to make a mention of nurses. Women and men had been providing care to the sick and injured since human beings started getting together. Religious orders started to care for locals and strangers alike, and hospitals developed. It was a struggle over many years to get women who were doing this kind of work outside the home to be accepted. If you ever have been sick and in a hospital, you are aware of the good work nurses can do. So we'll talk about our main aspect here. Back in the day, people were cared for in their homes. The hospital was a necessary institution for dependents and the working poor. They ran under the hospitals ran under the same principles as running a proper Victorian household: cleanliness, order, ventilation, efficiency, economy. Hospitals were not places where you chose to go if you could help it. House calls by the doctor were the norm. Care at home, even surgery done at home, was what happened. There were no labs or ERs or ICUs the way we think of in hospitals today. If you didn't have family or if you were indigent, there was no place for you to get care and no person to provide that care. And because germ theory was just starting to be taken as gospel, it wasn't the idea of, oh my gosh, the kitchen table, it's not sterile, we can't do surgery here. So it was not unusual to have surgery done in your house if necessary. By the end of the 19th century, germs and contagion and the need for cleanliness was the norm. The rapid advances in technology, such as X-ray machines or sterilizers, or even wearing gloves during surgery, was common by the 20th century. I'll just briefly mention Hudson Hot Springs, which is now called Fenwick. Even though this was not a hospital, it was a place where you could relax and get good food if you could afford it, and more of a resort in our minds today. But the warm and hot springs on the property had minerals in the water, and many were helped, especially if they had arthritis or rheumatism. So even though it wasn't a hospital, it may have been the closest some people got to having health care. And the springs were used by the Apache in earlier times as well. I'll mention pest houses. This is not a picture from Silver City, but this is the type of pest house you might expect during an outbreak of smallpox, which we had fairly frequently in Silver City. It was used to isolate patients, and I can imagine that the neighbors were not too thrilled to have the town rent a house to isolate patients. And then after the outbreak was over, I can't imagine many people were too thrilled about renting that house to live in. And that's why townsfolk were happy to hear that the Sewing Club wanted to start a hospital. In the early 1880s, in Silver City, about a dozen of the well-to-do women would gather in their sewing club, and they would discuss what needed to happen to fix the town, such as starting a public school or volunteer fire department. In 1883, they hit upon the idea of starting a hospital to, quote, provide some sort of shelter care for treatment for the aged and sick prospectors and miners. Martha Miller was the head of this group of women, and she explained to her husband they needed a place to start a hospital. John Miller had a planing mill near what is now Dairy Queen, and agreed to let the women commandeer one of the cottages at the hospital, at the planing mill. And remember, no electricity, no running water that had to be hauled from a well, no indoor plumbing, no registered nurses. And that also would not be mandated in New Mexico until 1923. Dr. Slow helped out. He did the first surgery there. Because they needed light, they cut a hole in the roof in the southwest corner of the cottage. And they would do the surgeries there only in the afternoon when the sun was at its best. Mr. Miller was elected to the territorial legislature, and when in Santa Fe contacted his wife to say if the ladies incorporated, he thought he could get money from the territory to help fund the hospital, which turned out to be $250 a month. And then the county pitched in half of that. And the amount of money changed periodically. Because things were getting tight in this little cottage, the women soon realized they needed to move to a larger location. The first courthouse, which was at the head of Broadway and Cooper, was opened in 1884, and the previous structure that had been used to house the county offices, such as the sheriff and the county clerk, had been on Hudson Street. As they finished a set of offices in the courthouse, they would move from Hudson Street up to the new courthouse, and the women decided they wanted to use that old county building on Hudson. So where was this second hospital location? It's next to our post office on Hudson Street, where the Forest Service warehouse is now. There was this building, you can see on the map, as the county office. It had 4 rooms, which were made into 2 wards, a kitchen and a matron's room. The jail was next door, and that's where, like I said, Billy the Kid shimmied up the chimney to escape incarceration. They had set visiting hours from 9 to 11 in the morning and 6 to 8 in the evening. In 1885, it was remodeled. You can see here the original and then the expansion. And 8 rooms were added. The railroad tracks now came down Hudson, and our little hospital looked like this. Here's the main structure and then the addition and the brick fronting that had been added to the original adobe. And then another view, you can see here, here's what is now the big ditch and previously Main Street and the walk bridge across it. If you look at the right hand of the photo, you can see this same structure of the hospital here. So you have an idea of the location in that. Here it is again, a little later. Pretty much unchanged as the years went by, and by 1902, they had added electric lighting to the building because several townspeople donated funds to do that. Now, if you will note this little house across the road here from the hospital, the red light district had been further away on around Spring Street and Texas Street. And then they started moving down to the area where the hospital was. Things became so problematic that in the 1890s, the hospital board declared in the minutes that no lewd women should be allowed to visit men sick at the hospital. Still looking the same, which brings us to the nun story. The Sisters of Mercy came to Silver City in 1882. Sisters of Mercy are Irish origin, and their main function is education and healthcare. They built a school called Our Lady of Lourdes the next year. It had 16 rooms, and by 1889, they had added healthcare into the mix and asked Mr. Martin Bremen if they could use his house, which was up near the courthouse, to start a hospital for the miners. They contracted with a couple of mines to have care for them. And then a few years later, they moved to a location further north. And one of the doctors in town, they hired to keep track of their patients, and he actually put in a telephone. Okay, so Our Lady of Lourdes here, it has a further story that we'll talk about soon. In 1915, the Sisters of Mercy relocated to Arizona, and the Sisters of St. Joseph took over. Mother Mary Magdalene ran the school and the hospital, and the big plan that she had was to build a larger school further north of town. And it turned out that the women of the sewing club, because they wanted to relocate away from the red light district and use a donation that had been provided to do that, bought the hospital bought the Lady of Lourdes and turned it into a hospital in 1918. The sisters started St. Joseph's Hospital further a few blocks away, and the original house that was on the property, you can see how they expanded it. In 1902, they decided to expand into a sanitarium, and that kept on with the expansion and additions. Dr. Bullock had been a doctor at Fort Baird, and wasn't satisfied with the way patients were treated. So he approached Mother Paul of the Sisters of Mercy and asked about changing or adding a sanitarium to St. Joseph's Hospital, which they decided to do. And you can see some of the views. They added more rooms around the block, and then closed the courtyard, and fruit trees were planted. You can see a nun here and a registered nurse here, trained nurse, I should say. But by 1919, the sanitarium had closed and was turned into an apartment for consumptives. Over the next decade, it was under the care of different managers trying to rent the rooms, and eventually closed and turned into permanent apartments. There were some other facilities around the area. Santa Rita, which opened in 1911. Magallon had its own hospital. Out at Old Tyrone Mine, they had its own hospital. Dr. Bullock didn't like how things were going at St. Joseph's and opened his own place, Mew Mexico Cottage Sanatorium. And that eventually closed as things changed as far as treatment or availability or antibiotics were developed. It was quite a homey little place, had its own pharmacy, and its Woodville Pavilion had billiards, and you could play cards and piano, etc. And everything was trying to be kept homey and tidy. And trained nurses again. They would have various and sundry entertainments because it was fairly boring around. Tuberculosis becomes the name of the game of their sanatoria startup. Some of them playing down the aspect of disease and the advantages of going to a resort. We did have one SAN that was specific to African Americans, and we can find very little about it. And it was started in 1910 and was east of Silver City. And so far, I have not come across too much information. One of the sanatoria was bought out by the Methodists and changed into the National Methodist Sanatorium. For the use of people who belonged to that church, and also they contracted with various companies around the country to send their employees there. The West San Hotel San Vicente was bought by one of the women from the Sewing Club and revamped the hotel, the Timmer House, to a high standard. And other places, Rest Haven, Children's National Tuberculosis Sanatorium, White Cross Sanatorium, etc. Fort Bayard was started as a military fort, and then in 1899 developed into a sanatorium for soldiers and sailors. Cot duty was one of the norms, and then trained nurses, of course, were quite necessary. They also had their ways of entertaining, menus for special occasions, arts and crafts, and then just silliness. The Great Depression added the alphabet soup of Roosevelt's administration to get funding. They were able to develop a proposal and build what was variously called Swift Memorial Hospital, Grant County Hospital, and finally Hillcrest Hospital. And then we have Gila Regional Medical Center now. As Mrs. Warren put it, the systematic care of the sick parallels the growth and improvement of Silver City and marks the progress of the social consciousness of our people. There certainly are other sticks by which to measure the social consciousness, but I find the history of medicine an enjoyable way to explore this. Thank you. And if you have questions and comments, please let me know.
All right, thank you very much. Let's see here. Thank you, Heather. That was a phenomenal presentation. We have some questions from the audience for you. So just a couple of those. An anonymous attendee would like to know if both lead and mercury were used to isolate silver from quartz. Are there accounts from the 1870s to 90s of poisoning from lead and mercury? Do you have any idea on that?
As far as I know, yes, those were used. I don't think that I've read any particular newspaper articles or other material about that, but as far as Silver City goes, I imagine that there would have been, but there may not have been much recognition of that as a diagnosis.
Okay. And someone would like to know, Isabella Greenway lived in a tent in Cat Canyon. Do you have any idea where that is or
Yeah.
was?
Yeah, she was involved with the New Mexico Cottage Sanatorium.
Okay.
I have read that Cat Canyon was in the boroughs, and I have read that Cat Canyon was near New Mexico Cottage Sand. So I am not quite sure which one is which. I know she did wind up out near Old Tyrone in the Pines Resort. So because she has a connection to each location, I'm not exactly sure where Cat Canyon is located.
All right. Susan Berry, if you can hear me over there in our Stallers room. I don't have your camera on right now, but do you have anything to add on that?
Cat Canyon was very close to Cottage Sand, a little farther to, I think it was the north.
Okay.
Did you hear that?
Yes, we do. Thank you, Susan. And B would like to say that this was so well researched and she is grateful that it is recorded. Stephen, you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Great presentation, Doc. I just wonder, do you know anything about health conditions and healthcare in the half of Silver City's population that was Mexican in those years?
Most of the patients who went to the hospital were Hispanic background. The diseases or the conditions varied widely. Some things were mining connected, such as broken legs, falling down the mine shaft, etc. Other things had to do with sort of alcoholism, just general debilitation. But is that the kind of thing that you're asking about, the type of reasons why they would be in the hospital?
How about folk remedies? Do you know anything about that?
So curanderismo is still practiced here and in various places in New Mexico. So yes, they did have curanderas back in the day, who they were treated separately from the hospital or Western medicine. So yeah, that's a very good point. They did use herbs, and they did have pateras who delivered babies, and they sort of had their own way of taking care of folks in their community.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was Stephen Fox, who you'll be hearing from in a couple of weeks on the environment. He is one of our stallers, of which we have, of course, Heather here, and 4 more of them are in the room adjacent and will be joining us for our community conversation after a short break, as well as Mr. Charlie Alfero, and I'll be bringing him on, and Dr. Montoya, Dr. Don Montoya, and the most important people of all, you out there. So stay tuned, take a 5-minute break, go do whatever you have to do, stretch your legs, and we will be right back with some more, a little talk about, what happens now, what comes up next, where are our problems, and, what has this wonderful history led to, and where do we go from here? All right, see you soon. All right, hi, everybody. Very shortly, we will have our stallers should be unmuting and joining us back again here soon. There they are. Hey, Doug, will you go ahead and close the door behind you? Or just a little bit or mostly? Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming back. I hope you had a good break and stretched our legs, and now we can get a little bit more in depth with this. And I also want to throw out another shout out to New Mexico Humanities Council for partially funding this series, as well as Western Institute for Lifelong Learning. All right, so I would like to introduce our guest commentators. We have here Mr. Oh, nope, whoops. Sorry, Charlie Alvaro, founder of HMS and former director of the National Center for Frontier Communities, as well as director for the rural outreach of the University of New Mexico Health Sciences, and director of the Community Health Service Division in the New Mexico Department of Health. So he has a little bit of a interest in this matter. Is that correct?
I do. For 43 years.
Wonderful. And Dr. Don Montoya. He was born in Fierro, New Mexico, and attended med school at UNM. Did his residency at University of Oregon Health Sciences Center in Portland, Oregon. I lived there for 6 months. It's very wet. And practiced medicine for 35 rewarding years, as well as spent 6 years researching an unpublished manuscript about the early history of Grant County, New Mexico. So he also has a little bit of something to say about history and medicine. And here we have some of our scholars. We have Doug Dinwiddie, who presented on the role of government in Grant County. And so he is our expert on government. We have Dr. Scott Fritz, who presented on small businesses and is our expert on the local economy. And we have Susan Berry, who presented on community building. And she is our expert on that, as well as being former director of this museum and author. So let's see. Once again, I would like to hear from all of you. So please let me know and contribute to this conversation. You can also talk to our panelists and to each other in the chat box here. So we want to hear from you. How do you think we did? Dr. Montoya, you're muted. You have to hit the microphone, lower left-hand corner. Click the microphone. There you go.
All right. The presentation was pretty comprehensive. Spent a lot of time discussing the infectious disease aspect of medicine in general. She did a very good job. I might point out that smallpox is completely eradicated throughout the whole world. There was a period of time, just like vaccinations today, vaccinations were under suspect in terms of causing problems. So here in Grant County, there was a major push to have vaccinations that were promoted by Doc Bailey, who was a pharmacist, and Dr. Keenan, that was mentioned as one of the physicians who practiced in Grant County very early in the 1870s. I think that's a start. I might also add, in regards to licensing and whatnot was mentioned. Actually, the territorial legislature in January of 1882 session was promoted by Dr. Keenan to initiate regulations in terms of medicine. So by February of that 1882 year, they started to institute medical control. And this was done because there was a lot of quackery in Grant County during that time. There was snake oil that was promoted. There was ointments and whatnot. There was a fellow that was probably way ahead of his time in terms of using magnet for curative purposes. And if you extrapolate that to present time, the MRI, which is a magnetic component to visualize organic structures. So after the board was formed, the Board of Medical Examiners was formed, Dr. Keenan happened to be the first chairman. So that's a real feather in Grant County's hat that he was so prominent. Other things that I'd like to mention is the surgery that Dr. William Slow did. He did it in 1883. This was done at the Ladies' Hospital. As was mentioned, the lighting was very poor. And the first surgery that I'm able to document that occurred there was a woman who on horseback was bucked and her lower abdomen was traumatized, which in essence ruptured her bladder. So Dr. Slow did the first surgery on the kitchen table. The anesthetic at that time was chloroform, which had been developed through the Civil War. And the light was held by a lady holding a lamp over the operating table. So needless to say, there was no sterility, but as I understand, the woman survived. Another thing I'd like to mention is that in developing the hospital, the charity hospital, in 1936, when the WPA was encouraged to help public buildings to be built, and the Silver City Council suggested, well, they knew they needed a new hospital. They recommended for Dr. Randolph Watts to go to St. Louis, Missouri, to hopefully obtain the property or the land to build a hospital from a William Swift, which then became the Swift Memorial Hospital. Dr. Watts he was a very prominent physician in this community. He actually was born in Virginia, and he is first found in the 1920 census in Santa Rita. He obviously participated in the Santa Rita Hospital that treated the miners and whatnot. The copper mine or the copper price crashed about 1921. And so the next time you find Dr. Watts is in Silver City, where he had established a practice. And he was very active. He died in 1976. While he was residing in Hawaii.
Oh.
There was another position that I want to mention, as Tyrone had its own hospital, and it was about the population in Tyrone was about 600 to 700 miners. There was a fellow by the name of Nathaniel Friesen, who was the physician. He was also from the East. He was one of the major physicians at the Tyrone Hospital. Again, just like Dr. Watts, when the copper price crashed in 1921, he came to Silver City and established a practice.
Thank you, Dr. Montoya. I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit to a little bit of the more modern era, and see if we can learn anything as well about that.
Well, I might tell you that the physicians prior to all this time, they came from back east or the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
In 1970 is when local individuals went to medical school and are now in the community besides myself, just Dr. Arizaga, Dr. Thomas Sparks, Dr. Carrion. And if I miss somebody else, I'm sorry, but this is a new generation from people that were born and raised in Grant County.
Wonderful, thank you. We're so lucky to have talented physicians that are from around this area as well, and know the needs of this area that are, you know, different from the rest of the world in some cases. We face a lot of issues here that aren't necessarily national wide issues, having to do with financial security and just the remoteness of where we are, that I would imagine makes healthcare a slightly different beast. Am I correct in that, Charlie?
Well, yes, I think I spent most of my life working on that very issue, and access to healthcare in rural and underserved populations. And I think policy over time is another aspect of the historical change in healthcare in Grant County that is really important. You know, New Mexico has a public health system that's operated by the state rather than by the county. And that has had a certain impact on the ability of communities to address local healthcare problems, since the structure and the services provided in public health offices are normally determined in Santa Fe and by the Department of Health. On the other side of things, in New Mexico, we've given counties the responsibility for assuring access to hospital services and giving them a lot of flexibility in self-taxation in order to sustain healthcare locally in a hospital setting. And I think that has had its benefits and downsides too. Everything has both sides to it. But one of the upsides of that is that in the last time that there's been a major change in the financing through Medicare of hospital services, where 600 hospitals in the country closed in the 80s during the Reagan administration, there were essentially none that closed in New Mexico. And that fact that the counties could tax themselves to make up for deficits and payments by the federal government is part of that model. So I think New Mexico's history about healthcare structure really plays into how things have worked in Grant County. In terms of access to primary care services, that's been an evolutionary process over the last 40 years in New Mexico and about 50 years in the United States, where there have been special resources set aside to add to community resources to help ensure that physicians would be able to be recruited, like through the National Health Service Corps and the State Loan Repayment Program, that community health centers would develop, which they have developed really well in New Mexico over the last 40 years, through direct funding by both the state and the federal government. And at the federal government level, for federally qualified health centers like HMS, there are special payment systems under Medicare and Medicaid to ensure access to underserved populations and uninsured people. So those sorts of policy environments, to me, are the way I think about rural healthcare and its involvement. And I'm really glad there's scholars working on the actual service delivery systems. But I know historically, over the last 40 years and 50 years nationally, there have been major improvements in primary care financing. And primary care is, in my mind, the baseline service required in a rural area to sustain the other services available locally. And that's why it's so critical that we have a good primary care system.
Did I hear you right, just to make sure I have this correct, that our structure around here, our healthcare center, is structured more from the state than from a local level? Is that?
Well, no, all the federally qualified health centers like Hidalgo Medical Services are locally owned. They're nonprofit organizations with local boards of directors.
Mhm.
They're all individually owned. In order to receive federal and or state funding under certain programs, there are certain things you have to have, like a board member, a board size of between 9 and 25 members. You have to have scale. You have to have board approved policies and procedures. But those things are determined locally, although the federal government may require them. So there's no federal operating of local health services, but in order to receive federal funding through grants and or Medicare and Medicaid, you must meet certain standards and criteria of operation.
Okay. Looks like we have a couple of questions. Let's see, here's to go along with what you were saying, Charlie. An anonymous attendee wants to know if any of the panelists are aware of the U.S. House Bill number 2317, the We Will Not Comply Act. Can any of you respond to her position? You know, I'd kind of like to keep this somewhat not political. If anyone has a broad statement to make about what is covered in that act, that's fine. But let's not bring politics into this. Let's keep healthcare and politics a little separate for the moment. And if you would like, then we can address this through emails, perhaps after the fact. Basically, she would like to know about efforts and being proactive about the current COVID situation and what maybe what efforts are happening in this community that you might know of. Anything on that?
Yes, I can tell you that over the past few months, well, for the past year, Grant County has had 41 deaths. And over the past couple of weeks, we had a new death. So now we've had a total of 42. There's about 69% of the population in Grant County has been vaccinated, which is good. There's about 10% positive rate in Grant County. What's interesting is that over the past couple of weeks, the positive rate has raised up to the level we were at back last February, I believe. So there is an uptick on what's happening right now. That's all. I don't know how many people have been in the hospital, but that's the latest news I can tell you.
And you know, COVID has really put us all under the microscope, so to say, in the healthcare and different communities. And I am actually pretty impressed with how we've kept up. When I had my vaccination, it was very fast and very easy, and it seemed very well organized in our 69%, you said, vaccination rate. So I think that in some ways we've done very well, but it's also exposed a lot of cracks that have existed in our community and in others. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I'd just like to say, first of all, before we go any further, that it's been about 8 years since I've been affiliated with HMS, and there are other people running that show, and I just want to make that clear that I no longer represent them at any level. There are a lot of state and federal programs available right now to assist communities in providing access to vaccines and to support public programs that have lost resources because of the reduction in patient visits, et cetera. Through our Center for Health Innovation, we contract with the Department of Health to provide information to schools and school-age children around and their families around vaccinations and availability and scheduling and those kinds of things. And I think there's been a pretty well thought out process for people obtaining vaccinations. And that's why we have such a high vaccination rate.
Agreed. Dr. Montoya, you've talked about an increase in COVID cases the last couple weeks. So that really, it feels like we're on a precipice across the world and here. And it's just, it's a scary time. It honestly is. And I think in some ways we're all at a point of, we thought that this summer was going to be an ending point, that, oh, we have the vaccination and we can all breathe easy now. And it's not necessarily happening the way that we all hoped and thought that it would. With that, you see about right now heavily in Florida, they're hot, and the southeast hospitals are really strained to their breaking point. People are exhausted. I know we are in a much better state here due to the efforts of many in the community and in the healthcare community. But our people are tired too. So what do you hear from the front lines? I know you guys may not be practicing at the moment, but you have your ears to the ground. I know you have a little bit to say. How are we holding up? Our doctors and nurses that are practicing, how do you think we'll be able to keep up this pace if it goes on another year, too?
Yeah,
Well, go
I
ahead.
think Dr. Montoya, go ahead.
The capacity of some hospitals is overwhelmed to the extent that elective surgeries, elective procedures have been put aside to accommodate those that are infected. So it's the capacity of the hospital. It's the availability of medical equipment such as respirators. There's only X number of respirators, and they're scrambling to transfer respirators from one region to another. The personnel that are working this is under extreme difficulties because of the isolation of the patient, the isolation of equipment, the potential infection for the caretakers. So it's gonna crack here pretty soon because there's no new faces. I heard recently that one of the southern hospitals is so short of medical staff that they are willing to pay nursing staff a $25,000 bonus, sign-up bonus. So that is an indication of where we are right now. And it may also be an indication of where we're going to be again in another 4 or 5 months.
Charlie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I do think the systems are strained and individuals are strained. I went on Facebook, I'm getting, seeing posts from local physicians who are frustrated with the spiking that we're having right now. I'm afraid personally that if we could attain a national 70% vaccination rate, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but it seems to me like the opportunity for mutations or variations to develop changes in a smaller population. Those are reduced. The larger the population that has the virus or condition, the more likely we are to see mutations in it. And these mutations occur in larger populations. The smaller the population that has it, the less likely we are to see mutations. And that's the way I look at it, is that we need to get as many people vaccinated as possible to reduce the opportunity for mutations in order to see light at the end of the tunnel. I think as long as we have large outbreaks in particularly other states right now, and we don't have to name those, then the opportunity for that to continue under different Delta variants or Kappa variants or whatever you want to call them will continue, and we'll be strapped for this for many, many months or years.
Agree, yeah. Dr. Montoya, you mentioned some new cases and that you're aware of. And does anyone know if the latest cases are from Delta or Delta variant?
No, I don't know. I don't know that at all. And I'm not sure. See, they're not separating the type of virus
Yeah.
that that we're presently dealing with. And Charlie's right. There's a new mutation to a lambda virus that apparently is even more virulent than the Delta that we're concerned about. So, Charlie, you're absolutely right. This is going to be a long ride for everybody, because it's not just the United States. This is around the world. This is a pandemic.
Yes.
And there's a population shift from one country to another. And as long as we're not completely vaccinated endemically, we're going to have difficulty.
Mm-hmm. And we saw earlier from Heather's talk a little bit of what vaccinations and vaccines have been responsible for getting rid of and having us not suffer anymore today throughout history. And I mean, I think people forget that it's been relatively recently in the development of mankind that we have vaccinations and that we have pandemics. It's, 200, 300 years ago, people didn't fly back and forth from one continent to another. Populations were isolated, so things didn't spread as quickly, things didn't mutate as quickly. So in terms of recent history, it is a whole new ballgame with what we're dealing with. Agreed?
Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
I would like to comment one thing.
yes.
If we take a broad view of crises, whether they are political, whether they are international, whether they are health related, generally speaking, of course, the nation has weathered many crises of many different kinds of origins over the years. But it's been said that crises and emergencies don't build character, they reveal it. And personally, I have a lot of concerns right now about what is being revealed about our national character. And everyone can reach their own conclusions in regard to that. But that's just an observation I wanted to share.
Good point. Thank you, Doug. But we are a community built to last, as Susan would say. So the overall structural strain of our healthcare system is really the cracks in people and the cracks in our systems are really starting to show. And, there is the possibility that it will get worse over time. So as we were talking about, Dr. Montoya, that not just the COVID cases itself, but it places a strain on everything else that has to be pushed aside to deal with the COVID epidemic as well, correct? So, and we had talked a little bit about getting finances and a shortage of equipment and of personnel. So throughout earlier in this conversation, Dr. Montoya, you talked about the importance and how lucky we are to finally have this first generation of locally trained physicians as well. And Charlie, you talked about our efforts in recruiting from outside. So where is the support going more to, and where should it go to? Go on.
That's something I'm working on almost exclusively these days, and have been for a while. So one of the trends, thankfully, in the last few years that have been going on is the decentralization of physician training.
Mhm.
Historically, about 80% of all the doctors in the country are trained between Washington and Boston. And that leaves 20% of the physicians trained in the country to be spread around the rest of the United States. We'd like to see that change. And even in New Mexico, where there's been a centralization of training in Albuquerque of physicians over the last 20 years, we've decentralized that a little bit by having training programs for family medicine in Santa Fe and Las Cruces. And under the current administration and legislature, there's been several bills that have passed that are about financing rural physician training, primary care training in better ways. Pretty much the healthcare system, the way it pays for healthcare, incentivizes hospitals and especially urban academic training centers and teaching hospitals to train subspecialists more than they train primary care docs. And the ratio is about 80% subspecialists, 20% primary care in the country, where the goal should be around 50-50. But the payment system and the revenue generating in hospitals in urban areas requires them to have a lot of subspecialists to sustain their financial goals. That makes the pool of primary care providers that can be recruited for rural areas very small. And we still have to compete with shortages in urban areas to recruit rural primary care providers. So 10 years ago, we set up a family medicine residency program in Silver City. This year, we expanded the program in Las Cruces into a local community health center there. Alamogordo received its first residents this year. Gallup started a residency program this summer. Next year, we'll have one in Shiprock. And I'm working right now with St. Vincent, Christus St. Vincent in Santa Fe, and the hospital and primary care center in Espanola to develop a family medicine training program there. We're also, and this is a great support by the Human Services Department, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services has approved sort of incentivized payments for rural areas to train physicians. And we're looking at submitting an application for accreditation for a psychiatric program in Las Cruces and developing a new psychiatric residency in the Gallup area. So we're very actively looking at decentralizing what is a very urban-based model for training. And there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work for rural healthcare. When you're in a large urban hospital where every subspecialty is available across the hallway, so to speak, and you have easy referral patterns. It's different than practice in a rural area where primary care providers and even specialists have to make a broader range of decisions and manage a broader range of patients. So training people where you want them to work makes more sense in terms of the quality of healthcare that's provided in a rural area over time. And those have been really good recent changes, both federally and statewide in terms of payment policy for physician training. Glad you asked.
So Dr. Montoya, how does that reflect your experience and perhaps when you were going into medical school yourself at UNM, correct?
Yes, well, let me tell you, it's a quantum leap in terms of what's happening what has happened over the past 2 or 4 decades of medicine. We rely more on the microchip than some hemostat of some sort. So medicine has just changed tremendously, and it's going to continue to change. Telemedicine is really playing an important part in how we take care of people. That really, like Charlie says, it extends medical care into the very rural areas, which is a real positive thing. But medicine is a day-to-day practice. It's just, you have a relationship between patients, a relationship between people. Not only that, but you have to relate with your colleagues as well. And it's it's a dynamic sort of process.
Yes, thank you. Going back to the COVID, we have another question from Sharon McDonald, who I'm not sure if we know the answer to this, but some of you may have been doing some reading that I have not. What hope do the mRNA vaccines offer? That they seem to be faster to produce?
Well, it wasn't so much that they're faster produced, you know, virology has been really studying this for about 10 years. They had the mechanism of messenger RNA development of virus. That wasn't the issue. The issue was isolating the specific COVID virus. Once they isolated that virus, then they could develop the vaccine. So it wasn't a quick sort of thing, like they just developed it over the past in a 2-month period of time. That's not how it happened. So there's a long process has been happening to get to this point, and the studies to validate the efficacy of viruses that we have now, every month we get new and new data to realize how effective a specific virus is. So it's not new. This has been happening for quite a while.
Thank you.
I don't have anything to add to that. That's great.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So we had talked a little bit Heather had spoken a little bit about previous pandemics we've had other talks about, and we have talked about that as well. So can anyone who is a little bit more versed on the historical aspect of this let us know how in previous pandemics we dealt with the strain? We've had lots of talks that, we've had not lots, but we've had a few talks that have focused on the pandemics themselves, or we've heard about the tuberculosis or the Spanish flu we had from Stephen Fox a few months ago. And it gave us a little bit of an insight into how we dealt as a community with those pandemics, specifically those diseases. But how did we deal with the stressors and the fallout from other diseases? I mean, from things that we had to push aside, the same way that we're having to today. Did that make sense at all? I just went all over with that, didn't I?
I'm just trying to think of, within my frame of reference, anything that's been like this during my lifetime. And
Well, there was the Spanish flu.
yeah, I'm not quite that old.
Well, I mean, I know that Dr. Montoya has done some historical research.
Right,
Stephen Fox, I know you're in there in the audience. Let me know if you're willing to, if you know anything about this. The Spanish flu, tuberculosis, so having an influx of a new infectious disease puts stressors like we've seen on the healthcare system in other ways. So how did we deal with having overrun hospitals, lack of money, lack of support, and healthcare providers in the past when an infectious disease epidemic has occurred?
Charlie, go ahead.
Huh?
Have Charlie answer that.
Oh, I'm not, in my frame of reference, and I don't do the historical research really that Dr. Montoya and others have done, but we've had flu shots for a long time. We've had the ability to prevent large-scale flu outbreaks because we've been able to give people flu shots.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not the flu, it's different, it's a virus. And so it requires a different response. But I think we've been prepared for some things better.
Mhm.
And fewer people have died as a result of that. And so that's been good. And certainly the advancement of science, chemistry, and technology has helped us develop things that prevent this sort of outbreak from happening. It's when we have new things like COVID that we have to then, have a shorter ramp up period to address it effectively. And it's important that everybody be on board and that the messages for health of the population be consistent. And without that, I think that's why we're seeing partially the reason why we're seeing a ramping up of the disease right now.
Yes.
Well, if you think about it as well, smallpox wasn't a pandemic, but in the United States, it was an epidemic. And if it was an epidemic in the United States, that it was occurring in other countries as well, probably not to the level of where it would fall into the classification of a pandemic, but through vaccination, the good education of people in terms of the safety of the vaccination, it became eradicated. I mean, there hasn't been a case of smallpox for probably 30, 40 years now, maybe even longer. I don't know what the exact number, but with good information, good response to the people, from the people, it would you can eradicate this.
Mhm.
But just like they had trouble convincing people to take the smallpox vaccination, mankind hasn't changed very much. We're still struggling with people to get the the COVID vaccine. So that's not going to change.
Yeah. There's an observation from one of our attendees who said that one of the things they noticed about this presentation was how the past community in the 19th and 20th centuries saw their current contagious diseases and finally moved to stop them with the isolation and mask protocol that we're still attempting to do today, and then by accepting science and vaccinations. And this is a proven strategy that has worked in the past to save lives, and that helped reveal these facts and will encourage us to continue to fight current diseases with community involvement. And I just wanted to relay that. Another question that someone has is, how does medical equipment influence the distribution of physicians, rural to urban? Someone said that they heard an account of a doctor who thought that he wanted to practice in a rural community until he discovered that he wouldn't have access to a fetal monitor. That's a good one for both of you.
Well, that doesn't sound right. Fetal monitors have been around since 1972. And in essence, you really can't practice good obstetrics without a fetal monitor. So it's hard for me to believe that some hospital wouldn't have a fetal monitor, and they're not that expensive. It's costs no more than a computer, actually. So there are certain pieces of equipment that do limit who practices in a hospital. For example, angiography is not practiced in rural hospitals because the equipment is expensive, and the physician has to be specially trained. Some rural hospitals don't have laparoscopy, for example, because it takes special equipment, special training. So there are some equipment that does regulate who comes to the hospital, but it's not small pieces of equipment. It's huge $1 million pieces of equipment.
Maybe that says something about our hospital's messaging, or the effectiveness of our hospital's messaging in recruitment, or just strange the role of rumor or assumption or lack of communication by
Yeah.
physicians potentially making those inquiries.
Generally speaking, the more specialized the medicine, the larger the population you need to have to support that service.
Mhm.
The more expensive the equipment, the larger the population you need to support that. Healthcare needs to be regionalized. You can't, live in a town of 500 and expect to get the same services that you can in a town of 500,000. But you might be able to expect your local provider to have a good relationship with those service providers in the larger population so that the services are more fluid and accessible. There are things we can do now in terms of analysis that are digitized, and services we can provide in terms of consultation and support of rural service provision through Project Echo and other telemedicine efforts. But in general, if you live in a rural area, in my mind, you should be able to expect a sound range of primary care services from prenatal through adult medicine. And that the more specialized your needs are, the less, you may be able to be managed locally, but you may have to go somewhere for more specialized care. And that's just the way the system's designed. And it's, there's a lot of, unfortunately, we're in a medical care system where revenue that you generate determines what you can do.
Mhm.
On the other hand, if we were in a budgeted type healthcare system, we might not have the budget for those to do those things anyway. So, we should understand where we live, what we should be able to expect, and whatever we get here should be high quality. And whenever we can't get it here, we should be able to have good relationships with other systems so that the service is seamless. I'm aghast at how expensive it is for people to travel for healthcare. If you're in the hospital and you have to be flown somewhere or whatever, and those are the kinds of issues that impede the delivery of high quality rural health services. In my mind, is the cost of those kinds of things.
Mhm.
Karen, if I may add
Yes, please.
something, speaking to the historical end of things, actually throughout many years, Silver City's hospital was known for having really up-to-date equipment. And that certainly goes back to the 1937 hospital that eventually became Hillcrest. There are accounts of medical practitioners coming here and being astonished at the quality of things, the type of equipment. I don't remember the particulars, but there was something involving some very cutting edge type of, that was a bad expression to use, operating table. That this person arrived having been trained elsewhere and not expecting to see something like this in Silver City. And there have also throughout time been a good deal of charitable contributions, fundraising that was done locally to provide some of that equipment.
I think you're right, Susan, that Silver City, from the standpoint of range of services available locally from a medical perspective and ancillary services potentially, and even dental, has had a greater accessibility than many, many other places in New Mexico or elsewhere. And I think that's a unique to this area for a variety of reasons. One is there's a heavy or large percent of the population of our area that have jobs that have insurance, whether it's the university, county government, hospital, Fort Baird, or the mines. Those types of jobs provide health insurance for people. And so we've had a smaller ratio of uninsured people in Grant County than even surrounding counties, significantly smaller. And because of that, we've been able to afford more services available locally. it's unusual for a town of 10,000 people to have 2 or 3 orthopedic surgeons, and other places of that size can't recruit OBGYNs. And that, so economics has played a large part in the range of service availability here. But even that has its limits. And that was my point. Regardless, there are going to be limits. And people may have to go elsewhere for certain very specialized services.
Scott, would you like to speak on that a little bit about the economy and healthcare? It does take up a large portion of our economy and represented quite a few small businesses as well as small practices.
The way that I interpret the rather large number of sanatoriums that developed at the beginning of the 20th century was that it brought patients here to the region. And these were relatively wealthy patients. You have to have money to come out west to benefit from the dry weather. And so some of these patients stayed around. I forgot the man that established the Burro Mountain Homestead, but that individual and his family were relatively well off. And so they spent their money locally. And also these hospitals, we haven't really talked about nurses. Nurses were employed and they paid, they spent their money locally. I always remember in the 1930s, it was my father's aunt who came to Silver City from either Illinois or Wisconsin to work in one of the hospitals here in Silver City. So I think that's an example, economically speaking, that healthcare can benefit our region in terms of business and in terms of the economy. And I also found interesting too that the cottage sanatorium that went out of business, when was that, 1929, 1930?
It was sold in 29.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
That the person that purchased that facility, he was renting out some of the medical equipment, or he was selling it. Can't remember.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think he tried to, keep it going to some extent, but it didn't have the kind of medical supervision as before. The same was true of a lot of the smaller sanatoriums. When the kind of lead doctor left, there would be these attempts by nurses or landlords, landladies to kind of keep them as a place where sick people could live and maybe see a local doctor.
And is it true too that local families rented rooms for TB patients?
Yes, yes.
So again, I look at history through the lens of the economy. I don't want to sidetrack our conversation too much, and I think about some of the hot springs, the one over in the Membris, as well as, of course, Faywood, to treat people suffering from arthritis, was another health industry that brought people to this region. And I also think about Western New Mexico University. We have a rather well-noted nursing program. And so I can't really speak to the level of education that those nursing students get. But I hear that it's a pretty good nursing program here at Western New Mexico University that I was sort of wondering if maybe if Charlie or Dr. Montoya could perhaps speak to the nursing program at Western New Mexico University.
I can attest that some of the graduates I had the opportunity to work with at Hilo Regional, and they were as well qualified as any nurse in any other hospital. So I can say unequivocally that the program is a good one. I don't know what percentage of graduates pass the nursing exam, but obviously it has to be a high number because it's still in existence. If there was high rate of failure, they'd have probably withdrawn the certification.
Yeah, so it made me think that we have a lot of local students that are seeking a nursing degree. And it sort of relates to what you were talking about, Dr. Montoya, that you have local doctors like Dr. Arizaga and yourself as well, who are serving the community. And that includes, I think, nurses. When I contrast that with my father's aunt who came from the Midwest to work here. So I think, yeah, so that's those were some of my thoughts.
You're muted.
Oh, thank you. I said thank you, Scott and everybody. We are getting a little bit along in time. So I would like to ask everybody out there, if you have any more questions or comments, please speak now or don't hold your peace. If you don't speak now, let me know in an email at education@silvercitymuseum.org, and I will forward those to the relevant parties, and I'll put that information in the chat box as well. If any of would any of our guests like to say anything as well?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Pleasure. You could obviously talk about any of these subjects you're bringing up here for hours and hours. It'd be easy.
That is the case, and we love doing it, and so lucky, and thank you for joining us, being able to come on today, both of you and our scholars as well. It's very much a privilege to be able to approach these subjects from so many different qualified perspectives, and to be able to get a historical view as well as a modern interpretation of that, and really dig in deeper. And so very grateful to be able to have you with us today. Charlie and Dr. Montoya as well, thank you so much for your time and your effort. Join Will, save some of their classes. It's a fantastic organization, as well as our partners at NMHC, the New Mexico Humanities Council, for funding this series. Also, I want to remind everybody that the Silver City Museum Society is a nonprofit organization that supports free programs like this to the community. So if you can, we do suggest a $5 donation, but anything that you can give, then we appreciate it. It helps us be able to keep going. And if you can't, then your being with us here today is really the best present that we could receive, and your engagement. So thank you so much for that. Also, one more favor, there is a link for a survey that gives us a little bit of feedback. It'll also pop up when we leave this meeting. So please just give us 5 more minutes of your time and take that survey. Let us know what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, how we can do better, and what you're interested in. And this helps us do our job serving the community. Speaking of serving the community, I want to say thank you as well to our scholars. We have a few out in the virtual audience that were unable to make it in person here today. Stephen Fox, who you'll be hearing from on the 21st of August, and he'll be talking about the environmental issues. And Tom Hester, you heard from a few weeks ago on diversity, is another very successful and interesting talk. And our scholars that are here today and very patiently sitting and observing and chiming in when they can. Dr. Doug Dinwiddie, raise your hand. Dr. Scott Fritz and Susan Berry. So thank you, everybody. Oh, I'm Erin Griffith. I'm the educator here. I always forget to introduce myself. It's great to see you guys. Hope you tune in on the 21st. And of course, thank you very much to Heather Moreland.